Hello, everybody. This is Andy Haley. My mother was a WASP in class 43-3, Lois Haley. You can see a replica of her over my left shoulder there, holding up her WASP photo and one of a little descriptor underneath about one of her accidents that she had while serving as a civilian for the U.S. Army back in World War II. In 1992, I first got to meet a lot of these women at a reunion in San Antonio. And shortly after that, I started developing a website about this group of women, which, was probably the third such website to go up. But I did, my own version of things. So there's a lot of information there available on my website. You'll see what the link is here shortly when I start up the presentation. And what I'm going to be talking about in my presentation is a group of 5 of these WASP from class 43-3 that include my mother. These 5 women served the entire 2 years together, all the way from January of 43 to December of 44, going through all the same training, all the same activities, all the same bases, ending up at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, which is where Mom settled after the WASP and where I was born and raised. So it'll be about those 5 women, but I'll also talk in generalities about all the women as a group. I'll also mention that there's a history that I've written of class 43-3 that's available from Texas Women's University. It's also available from my website. And there's a link to that, and we'll show that shortly. So without any further delay, let me go ahead and start the presentation here to share with everybody. Okay, so here are, again, this is a story about the Bigs 5, my mother and 4 of her classmates, as they spent 2 years of their lives serving during World War II. So this, the reason of the Bigs 5 is, of course, Biggs was where they ended up serving as part of the 6th Tow Target Squadron there at Fort Bliss, which was established, before the WASP were. So there were already men there, managing the Tow Target Squadron there at Fort Bliss. And then the women were brought in to enhance that training there at Fort Bliss and do a heck of a lot of other things there at Fort Bliss, where there was extensive, all kinds of training for troops done, and they got to support all of that. So here's my contact information, email address, the basic link to my WASP website, and a link there to the history that I mentioned earlier that I wrote that includes photographs, most of which my mother took during her time in the WASP, and a narrative that I produced based on what I've learned about this class via the TW website, via various books I've acquired about the WASP over the years. So it's a short read, but it's a good encapsulation of the class. Again, this presentation is about 5 women from that class, and I'll introduce it a little bit more. So there were 1,102 different WASP stories, and each one has their own uniqueness. The program was quite dynamic, especially in the first 6 months, which was the time in which my mother got her training. But it was quite dynamic in terms of requirements to get in, the different training you went through. It was all, the schedule for training was pretty well set. The graduation dates for every class were cast in concrete. So everything kind of at the end of these classes got crammed together, trying to catch up and what you might have, weather delays thing, etc. So the dates were about the only thing that was solid and didn't change, but a lot of other things did change, and we'll mention that as we go along here. So introducing the Bigs Five, Lois Zeiler there, and the sequence of pictures across the top match the sequence that in the picture down below from the El Paso Times recording when they showed up there in January of 1944. So you can see Betty Buddy in the middle there, the tallest one, and my mother on the far right as the short one. And her best friend was Lois Hollinger Zeiler. Both of them stayed in El Paso, became good friends. Both of them were a big part of my upbringing. The other two women, Kay Brick and Emma Ware, are shown next. Emma was the only one that had a pet. Widget, I think, was the name of the Pekingese puppy that later in the training program and all the time they spent at Biggs, Widget was there with them, went on travel with them as they performed their duties, and created lots of interesting stories for them to share ever since. So a little more perspective on, what was it like in the United States at the time, in terms of people and what people might have been doing. Population was about 200,000 less than it is today. So, a third of what we have today. And of that, of course, basically it's a 50-50 split. There were over 67,000 women in the country, and all of them were supporting the war effort in one way or another, whether they were collecting scraps for recycling or working in a factory, helping to build aircraft, or like these group of women learning to fly for the Army. 3 million of those, like I said, in the factories and elsewhere, were in direct support of the war, as in a factory, as an employee of the government, that kind of thing. Now, compare that to the 15 million men that were called up to support the war and actually do battle, and over 400,000 lost their lives during that effort. Of the 67 million women, 25,000 were involved at that time in some kind of pilot training programs. This is a federal, your licenses were federally issued, so there was an accurate record of who all in the United States had licenses to fly. So that provided a resource for the Army to start identifying those 25,000 women to see if they'd like to become part of this program. So they were all interviewed, they filled out applications, a lot of things that were required, by the Army, so that they could review qualifications and decide who was worthy of Army flight training. So there were 1,830 women, and there were two different groups. The Women's Ferrying Training Detachment, and that group was started by Jacqueline Cochran under the auspices of General Hap Arnold in the Army Air Corps. And there was also a second group started by Nancy Love called the Women Airforce Women Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. Those 29 women were extremely highly qualified, with an average of over, I think it was over 1,300 hours of flight when that program got started in November. Both these programs started in November of 1942, but they just had different requirements. Minimum requirements for the WASP was 500 hours. but like I said, all of these women together, one of them had upwards of 2,500 hours, if I remember right, or more. The women for the other program, WFTD, their initial requirements were 200. Eventually, over time, because fewer and fewer women had that number of hours, and many women were getting training while the WASP program was active, so that they could qualify at a minimum of 35 hours to get into the program. So those, the physical requirements changed a little bit, like height and so on. Hours required, et cetera, were changed over time. Of course, at one point, Walt Disney was involved and helped develop their icon for the WASP. Fifinella was this gremlin's name, and she was a good luck gremlin. Helped all the WASPs as they went through training and later on during service. Of the 1,830 that entered the program, of the Cochrane program, 1,074 graduated out of 18 classes that were given over that 2-year period. The WASP had 28 graduates that were assigned to a military base, and they were assigned because they needed minimal training, Army training. They were assigned fairly soon after admission and graduation to the program. They were assigned to various ferrying squadrons around the country to start, laying the groundwork for what was to come with the other women that were trained later in the WFTD programs. These Wolf Teddy, as they're referred to, group of 18 classes, they started here in Houston, where I'm located. And that started in November of 92 with the first class. And because that class got started there so early in the program, they actually had a graduation ceremony here at Ellington Air Base nearby. Was the only class that graduated here in Houston. The other 17 classes graduated in Sweetwater after they moved there in May of 1943. For my mother's class specifically, 43-3, they came in January of 1943 with 58 qualified women, at least 200 hours of flight time, etc. Of those, 38 made it through the program and graduated at the end on July 4th, 1943. At one point during the later in the 1943 training, the two different programs were finally combined legally or with military requirements met, and became the Women's Air Force Service Pilots named. And this is approximately August 1943 that happened. Initially, all these women were being trained for 5 ferry commands across the country. 3 of the ferrying commands were Romulus Army Air Base up in Michigan, Love Field here in Texas, and Newcastle in North Carolina. And of course, you had one in Long Beach, I think, and I forget where the 5th one was. But that was the initial intent, was to send these women to support the ferrying program to transport new aircraft from the factory to the different coasts, including Alaska, where Russian women pilots picked them up and continued flying those warplanes over into Russia to support their battle with Germany. But that changed, and we'll see more of that here shortly. There was a total recorded number of miles flown as 60 million miles put on through the Women Airforce Pilots flights, a lot of territory. Now, relative to the ferrying programs and other programs, of those 60,000 miles, hope that's not hours. Anyway, 9 million were in support of the ferrying program. So a much larger number of miles and time were spent by these women doing supporting other commands and other activities all across the United States. Never outside the United States. They operated as a civilian group contracted through a company to work for the Army. So they still wore basically officer uniforms. They got to eat with officer mess. They got, special privileges for flying, so they could, if say they delivered an aircraft to some distant location, then they could get transport easily back to their home base after they had completed their delivery. For the entire program, 38 of these women lost their lives tragically. One of those 38 women is still unaccounted for. She disappeared flying a P-51 out of the Ferry Command in Los Angeles, and her disappearance wasn't even noted for days. So they had no idea where she might have lost control of the plane or whatever happened. So there have been subsequent searches by the family, but unfortunately it's in the flight path for the Los Angeles airport. So it's hard to get, approval to do searches to try and find the aircraft remains if they're there. There was an extensive search effort beyond that across California and Arizona, but nothing was ever found. For my mother's class, they actually lost 2 women during service. It wasn't during training in any of the training they had, but it was during the actual service, primarily at Biggs. Okay, so the initial training was, the main WASP training program at Sweetwater or here in Houston was for about 6 months. But at the end of that training, everybody, all the graduates received orders to go to a particular ferry command. In the case of these 5 women, Romulus, both Emma Coulter and Lois Brooks, my mother, were assigned to Romulus. Lois Zeiler and Betty Buddy were assigned to Love Field. Nobody was assigned to Long Beach, and Newcastle was where Kay Brick was assigned to. Now, as it turns out, they realized, as I mentioned earlier, they were graduating too many women to support the ferrying command requirements. So they had to find something else for these women to do. So when these 5 women reported to their ferry commands after like a 2-week, vacation or leave to visit with family or whatever, they received new orders to report to Washington, D.C. So I'm getting ahead of the game here. So let's go back to the training here. And it started in Houston. All classes were split into 2 groups because they had to do flight training plus ground school. So while half the classes training in airplanes, the other half was in ground school, learning, how to fix engines and how to lay out flight plans, etc. And the mechanics of, why do airplanes fly, etc. So in this picture, this half included Lois Zeiler, Kay Brick, and in the back, tallest one, Betty Buddy. As I mentioned earlier, 43-1 graduated in Houston. Then everybody moved to Sweetwater in May. So it was a big transition, a lot of planes to move, and the existing classes helped to move the training planes from Houston to Sweetwater. And Class 43-2 was the first one to graduate in Sweetwater. Class 43-3 was the second to graduate on July 3rd, 1943. Now, as I said, that was 6 months of training. Then, because they received orders to go to Washington, D.C. in July, they reported to Washington, D.C. They met with General Hap Arnold and Jacqueline Cochran, and they were told that this was a top secret meeting. They were being reassigned to tow target training at Camp Davis, and they were just, set off on a new task so that all the graduates would eventually have some military job to conduct. Okay. Part of the class that met, more than these 5 showed up to meet with Hap Arnold. It was about 22 is the numbers. So we'll see that here in a minute. So Camp Davis is in North Carolina. So from, midsummer to fall, early fall, they spent 3 months for tow target training that they were learning to fly an A-24 aircraft, which was a converted bomber. It was converted in the sense that the second cockpit had the pilot's chair removed, and inserted in the back was a large thimble, I guess you call it, a way to wind up the cable that was let out through the tail. So you had 3,000-foot cable wound up in the back of this cockpit, second cockpit, and hidden away down there also was a poor GI that was there to reel it in or let it out as needed, while the WASP pilot flew the plane back and forth for target practice. Of the 22, there were 15, such as, my mother and the WASP, the Bigs 5, that were initially sent there. 7 more showed up soon after, depending on their orders and how they could, fit them into the various barracks and facilities there in North Carolina. Well, they finished that up after 3 months, and part of the story I heard was that Lois Zeiler, who had always been interested in model airplanes, excuse me, got wind that there was another training program related to tow target involving remote controlled aircraft, drones, World War II drones, which were modified airplanes that the military already had. They just added electronics to it and a remote control joystick to control it from a second airplane. So some of the women decided, hey, I want to do that. So 12 of them were sent to Liberty Field in Georgia for PQ-8 radio control drone flight training. So that took them through December 1943. So they got a full year of training before finally getting assigned to a base. Now here, identifying who's in what picture, there's Betty Buddy, there's Lois Zeiler, and my mother, Lois Haley, at different times in that transition, the last 6 months of 1943, for additional tow target training. Emma Ware is also there. It was during their time at Camp Davis that they lost their classmate, Mabel Rollinson. And of course, there's always rumors about, why it happened, etc. And there are different stories related to that I was witness to. But these women were very strongly opposed to all the rumors about sugar in the gas tank put there by some of the male co-workers at the base, some of the military people at the base. Sugar was rationed, too expensive to, it wasn't easy to get hold of and used for odd purposes, such as putting it into an engine. Also, there were other factors. You're talking about aircraft. These are used aircraft that these women are subjected to. They had all kinds of maintenance issues, and in particular, Mabel's particular aircraft that she was flying that evening doing night training for tow target was that the latch to release the cockpit cover would stick, and you couldn't get it open except from the outside, and you had to have somebody else come up to the aircraft and open the hatch. Well, in her accident, there was nobody there to open the hatch. The pilot made a mistake. There was engine trouble. So they're trying to land the aircraft, but they hit the trees near the landing strip and crashed into the trees. The pilot was thrown free of the aircraft, but Mabel was trapped as the plane went up in flames. Very tragic loss. But it was, they were using secondary fuel because all the primary high octane fuel had to go to the military effort overseas. There's no way you could waste premium fuel on training and the just poor maintenance of the aircraft. So there's a lot of factors behind these accidents that don't fit the rumors that you hear a lot about. Well, they eventually got assigned to Biggs in January 1944. So the newspaper had a big report on it, and the picture was there, and my mother kept multiple copies of that newspaper from then. Biggs was probably based on the description provided in Bird Howell's book on Final Approach. It was one of the earlier books published about the WASP. It's half appendices with all kinds of details. And so there's details for each base that the WASP served at. So at Biggs, yes, they did tow target with the sleeves that were reeled out by the enlisted guy in the back of the aircraft. And then they went back and forth at different altitudes, depending on who was, shooting at the target. If it was machine guns shooting at the target, they'd fly low. If it was massive artillery weapons, they would fly at much higher altitudes. But there was a lot of separation between the flag that they were supposed to shoot at and the airplane. Unfortunately, sometimes the trainees shot at the wrong thing. So sometimes the women cut the flight short and came back. They just pulled the target in and flew back and landed. They also, of course, did the radio control training. That took two airplanes, one that had dual cockpit. So you had a pilot to fly the second plane. You had the co-pilot actually had the joystick to control the remote control plane, PQ-8 or PQ-14, whichever the case may be. And then you had the third pilot as a safety pilot in the PQ-8 or PQ-14. And that's where my mother spent a little of her time as the safety pilot. But they also did troop strafing with tear gas and smoke. They also got to fly at night to support training for searchlight experience. And so they were one of the few women that got to fly at night. They also got to fly at night for radar training and that was both daytime and nighttime activity. So they did a lot at Biggs. Occasionally did some ferrying. Unfortunately, here was when another classmate from a class that graduated much later, and instead of going to the extra training that these 5 women got, they were sent directly to the base for in-work training, forget the proper, so that Mabel, not Mabel, Leola McDonald here was put into an A-24 to do target training, and she was unfamiliar with some of the controls in this bomber. And one of the controls similar that had a handle in a similar location as the AT-6 for the landing gear controller, landing gear handle. This particular handle, though, was for the speed brakes on this dive bomber. So apparently, during her first time up in the aircraft, when she thought she was bringing the landing gear up, she was actually deploying the speed brakes during takeoff. So immediately the plane nosedived into the ground and she was killed. So the changes in the program, and the less training and putting the training on, the local base, making that their responsibility, was one of those changes that occurred during the program. And unfortunately, it led to a loss of life here. There they are at this time in Biggs in January or so. They finally got their uniforms. Their WASP uniforms finally came in. All right, they're one of my friends in El Paso that put together a short video. I've got a link here provided for that later about the Biggs 5 and the other women that served at Biggs. A short 20-minute video, historical video. The author of that video, the videographer, did some research there, and he found out about the mascot for the 6th tow target, which was Alexander the Swoosh. And of course, you got a badge to go with that. And it was named after one of the odd-looking aircraft there, what was called a Martin B-10. And that came into existence in the spring of 1942, before the WASP, Wolf Teddy and WAFs, all before the women training ever got started. Okay, that aircraft later had issues and got caught on fire, became spare parts, and apparently it took a while to get the Army to approve this design of Alexander the Swoosh as a tow target aircraft. So now more about the individual women. As I mentioned earlier, Lois Zeiler loved model airplanes. On the left, it's one of the planes she had. This was after they got out of the WASP program, and Lois Zeiler and my mother had purchased a home together in El Paso. So our two families lived together for a little while. So Holly had her model aircraft she built there on the left. She also made the model to the right, the little blue one, for my mother. It's a replica of my mother's Taylorcraft that she learned to fly in Reno, Nevada, where she was born and raised. So we'll see a little bit more on that later. But Lois Seiler was big into airplanes, and as we'll see, she had a troubled life. Both her parents were lost when she was just 12 years old. She did get to meet Amelia Earhart while she was in high school, and that was a big inspiration, of course. She soloed at 16 in 1936. Later on, unlike many of the women of the day, she got her mechanical engineering degree from Purdue with studies in aeronautics. After graduation, she started work with United Aircraft, put that engineering to use. Then, of course, she became part of the WASP program, starting in January 43 through December 44 when the program was disbanded. Soon after that, while they knew the program was going to end, both my mother and Holly, as we call her, Lois Zeiler, started getting their commercial instructor license from a local training aircraft, commercial pilot training, border Aviation, I think was the name of the company. So when they got out of the WASP, they had a job teaching GIs how to fly and get their commercial pilot licenses. That's also where they both met their future husbands. Holly married a man named Doyle, and they moved to a city 100 miles east of El Paso called Del City. Because while Holly was in the WASP, she bought 80 acres of farmland. At that time, it was 80 acres of desert, just west of the Guadalupe Mountains. And El Capitan was the highest peak there in Texas. It was easily observable from the valley below where Holly owned this farmland. So they went out there to do farming cotton and alfalfa and fruits and vegetables and raise cows and pigs and, basically live off the land. She taught high school math there for 18 years. In 1986, she was inducted into the Aviation Hall of Fame there in El Paso. If you go through the El Paso airport, the photographs of all the people that have been inducted into that Aviation Hall of Fame, I think are on a second story in the main terminal building somewhere, or a separate room somewhere. They moved them around from year to year. They used to be down on the passenger level, so the public could easily see them, but they got moved around. Also, while she was in Del City, she had her own plane and she taught flying there, including my daughter, Dawn. Okay, both my mother and Holly gave daughter Dawn some training. My mother trained me, but we won't get into any of that in any detail right now. I visited El Paso at one point, and Holly's oldest son, Donnie, had kept Holly's flight jacket with the Swoosh the Goose, Alexander the Swoosh logo on the jacket, and Hollingsworth name tag just above that. There's a close-up of that, early worn out version of the Tow Target Squadron logo. Next in line here was Kay Brick, showing they were doing some of her studies, probably in Sweetwater at that time, based on their dress with the shoes and so on. Her first flight was in 1934. Like Holly, she had a Master of Arts in psychology. Got her pilot's license in 1941 and became part of the Biggs effort, and had her own accident in June 1944. So 6 months after they arrived, she had her first accident that she lived through, and the pilot was blamed for this. There was some kind of training thing going on. I think they were doing touch and go landings, and during one of the go portions of the during takeoff after a touchdown for landing, somehow the plane tilted over, and one of the right wingtip hit the ground, and then the plane cartwheeled across the open grass, knocking off the engine, the tail, the two wings, and they were basically, minor injuries. The pilot was a little bit surprised when he got up out of his pilot's seat to try and stand up, and he fell through onto the ground because there was no metal floor underneath his pilot's seat after the wreck settled. But they lived through that fine, and the pilot got blamed for the accident. So, this is a picture of her. It's a portion of a wedding picture where Emma Coulter got married there as they got out of the WASP, but we'll see that a little more later. Throughout the rest of her life, she was always involved in aviation, flying everywhere, her own plane, etc. Her daughter continues that effort now with flying around the country and owns her own plane. And one of the planes she owned was a BT-13, and apparently she was able to fly it to Cuba at some point. She was, however, of course, denied a commission in the Air Force Reserve. A lot of the WASP women did join the Air Force Reserve after the WASP so that they could continue at least to be involved, in the Army Air Force in some way. She's also involved in the 99 Powder Puff Derby. Every year there was a race across the country for pilots. And she was also a member of the different flight organizations, National Pilot Association, FAA, etc. TPA was short for Thunderbolt Pasadena, and NPA is National Pilot Association, as I mentioned. So she was involved in all those organizations. She ended up over her time flying 60 aircraft for 6,000 miles of travel. She's also an author, and she maintained her license and flying for 50 years. There she is in that group shot from Biggs, 1944. Some of the other folks that were there, the WASP, and some of the other people in charge of that program. Now we have Betty Buddy, and in the shaded out picture on the left, she's holding Widget, Emma's little, I can't remember the name of the type of dog now, Pekingese, I think. And that was at their radio control tow target training in Georgia. And so it's just a little pup then. And it was some relative it gave that to Emma, one of Emma's relatives. Betty specifically became, a pilot in 1941. She had 75 hours of time when she joined the WASP in 1943. She logged, while in training, and this was typical for all the WASP, she logged 175 hours in that first 6 months of WASP training. At one point in the summer, I think it was July of, I think it's in the photograph here, if we look closer, Jacqueline Cochran was visiting the WASP training programs in Sweetwater there, and Life magazine, after they moved to Sweetwater, decided to do an entire issue about the WASP program. This is one of the photos, and Kay Brick Buddy is up in the Kay Doozer Buddy is up in the upper right hand corner. Jacqueline Cochran is shown sitting facing the camera with in a white blouse. They got another 100. She got another 100 hours while at Camp Davis, and then another 130 hours at Liberty Field, where she also spent part of her time as a mechanic, helping to maintain the aircraft there. Then, of course, they, like I said earlier, they got their WASP uniforms while at Biggs. That's one of her photos there in front of one of the barracks, where she earned 400 more hours while flying at Biggs. And while she was at Liberty Field, she met her future husband. And she left the WASP program a little bit early so she could go meet up with her husband in California and get married to Sergeant Buddy, December 1944. So as the program was coming to an end, Betty was getting married. Then it was back, remained in California, where she successfully raised 4 sons. Betty, eventually by 2010, Congress awarded the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal. Betty was the only WASP of these 5 able to attend in March of 2010. So that's a picture of her at the, I think it was an Air Force facility where we had a ceremony honoring the 38 women who passed away. Of course, back in California, she had numerous awards of recognition by the city, county, and state back in 2000. In addition to, and this was later after the Congressional Gold Medal in September, she got additional recognition once that was brought to their attention. Here we have Emma Coulter. A couple of different pictures. The shaded out picture on the left is Sweetwater, probably Sweetwater or Houston, while they're in ground school training. On the right, I think, is from Liberty Field in Georgia, where there's a little leisure time there to read a book, lay down, relax. Her family was into the military for 3 generations, including her, maybe some since. Although I don't think any of her children joined the military. Her grandfather and father, though, were generals. She was an only child, and of course, like many of us, me included, rebellious. Her first flight at age 19, and like Kay Menges, she had an MA in psychology. Well-educated women, all of them. Emma, and this is an interesting story here in that Emma and Private Willis flew to Houston to start her WASP training. And that started kind of a fuss about who's this Private Willis that she's flying with, and what does that mean? Well, it turns out that Private Willis was the name of her personal airplane that she flew to Houston in. So, but, it made for a good story. Here she is at Condren Field, which is north of Biggs, New Mexico, where they did their training, continued their training with the PQ-8 series of drone aircraft. This is a PQ-14 in this particular photo. So after a year of all that training for tow target, they ended up working out of Condren Field. Hear more about that shortly. So here's some more pictures of Emma and Widget. She'd always tuck him away in the overalls or underneath a big jacket. It was her Aunt Peggy that gave Widget to her at Liberty Field, and of course had to go to Biggs Field with her, with the puppy. She married Major James Ware, again, about the same time Betty Buddy was getting married, only Emma had her wedding at Biggs. where she met James Ware. They had 3 girls and then triplets. And she didn't really want to have children, but she had 6. But that's how life is. She also had some influence, and let's refresh my memory here. Some of the details, I'm looking at my other notes here that I have. And there's quite a few notes here I have for Emma. She was not the nurturing type. She was very businesslike in her manner almost all the time. So raising children just wasn't part of her character. So I don't see any other notes here. There was, she was a passionate animal and habitat lover, opera buff also. And this is one of, don't remember now if this was her father or grandfather. John B. Coulter served there at Biggs, Fort Bliss. I keep saying Biggs, but it became, there was an Army base called Fort Bliss. There was also Biggs Air Force Base. Those two were combined eventually into Fort Bliss, one Army, all Army with a big air base. And last but not least, my mom, for some of her stories. She started off as she got her graduate degree from University of Nevada at Reno, went to teach south of Reno in a little town called Minden. And because she was in a small 1-room schoolhouse in Minden, she was the only teacher. She could do whatever she wanted. Back in those days, if you wanted to lead a band, you could only do that if you were a man. So Mom, of course, decided there's nobody here to tell me what I can do or not do. She started her own band there in Minden. Rebellious, independent individual throughout her entire life. Now, one of her cousins, Jim Peckham, and his flight instructor, the name eludes me for the moment. Let me check my notes here if it's there. I didn't capture that. But they convinced her that they wanted to buy a plane. Those two wanted to buy a plane, but they didn't have enough money. And they knew my mom, who had been working as a teacher and saving all her money because she went home on the weekends to live with her parents. So she was able to save a lot of money, and they knew she did. So they convinced her to be a partner in purchasing a Taylorcraft, which we saw that blue model that Holly made earlier for my mom. She made it for my mom in remembrance of this early training. So they convinced her to buy the airplane, go in as a partnership. Eventually, she bought them out because they lost interest. Well, the war came along, and she became a full owner of that aircraft. Of course, when the war started, then she couldn't fly it. Here's an early picture of her in Houston during training with the WASP program. Later, here she is in Sweetwater, and she, had her banjo with her. That banjo still exists. I have it. I even tried to learn how to play it a few years back, but then I broke some bones in my hand and that came to an end. She had her accident at Condren Field, north of El Paso. And this was in January of 43 when they first got to Biggs. The commander there, wasn't used to women being part of his squadron. So he just said on a Sunday, why don't you guys go up to Condren Field and practice, your radio control training. So Mom was in this PQ-8. This is what it looked like after they got it upright again and pulled her out. As she said, they chopped it up to get me out. So that was her accident. She also had another one that she got a letter of commendation for. This is one of the A-24s they use for tow target. She went up in it, but when she came back to land, one of the landing gear wouldn't come down. They tried all kinds of maneuvers to shake the landing gear loose and get it to deploy, but it wouldn't. So she had to do a belly landing. And the only thing that was damaged basically was the skin underneath the wings there and the prop. Maintenance crew had it repaired and it was up and flying again the next day. Although I'm not sure I would have wanted to fly it. As I said earlier, when the WASP program came to an end, they trained before getting out of their civilian job with the Army to become commercial aviation instructors. So border aviation was where Lois Haley and Lois Zeiler went to work in January of 45. Okay. My mother at one point trained her father to become a student pilot. And the young man on the left was her youngest pilot. So she had her youngest and oldest pilot pose in this photograph that she had trained. The younger pilot later went on to become part of one of the airline. I had a little bit of contact with him in recent years. I think he's since passed on. Another example where they were doing team teaching. Then, after she met her husband, she got pregnant with me. And so she thought maybe a better, more long-term job for the future and for raising a family, at least one anyway, was to get back into teaching. So she became part of the El Paso Independent School District for 30 some odd years. It was one of her bands. Again, that's orchestra in this case. But she had orchestras and bands now in these more modern times of the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. And then there's another photograph from the teacher, annual photographs I take for teachers and students. She also, like Holly, was inducted into the Aviation Hall of Fame, but the mom was inducted the year earlier. And that's the plaque they put up that exists somewhere in the El Paso terminal that can be viewed if you seek it out. You got time there. Now, of course, as I mentioned briefly earlier, in March of 2010, the Congress awarded the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal, and such as they did for the Tuskegee Airmen also, and the Navajo Code Talkers. Finally, the WASP got their award. Mom at that time was too ill to travel, so Dawn and my daughter and I, traveled to DC to be part of the ceremonies there and to accept our copy of the Congressional Gold Medal on behalf of Mom. And then we had a little minor ceremony here at the house with some of her pictures in the background, airplanes on the piano. The piano is hers, that she had, that her father purchased for the family back in the 30s or 40s or whenever it was, long ago, maybe the 20s. So piano's been around a long time. And another picture of mom at Biggs where they got their new uniforms. But the reason I show this one again, as in the picture below that says Sweetwater, you see her banjo. Well, if you glance up just behind in the Biggs photo labeled Biggs, behind my mother's right leg is that banjo. And zooming in on it, you find out that the banjo drum head has been decorated with WASP icons. I don't know who drew them on there. Over time, they faded some, but for the different tow target squadrons they were at, plus Fifanella, are inked onto this. There's also a barely legible signature of Betty Buddy. So maybe that implies Betty Buddy drew these icons on the banjo drumhead. This banjo came back into my possession after mom passed away and was returned to me by the person she gave it to, which was one of her best friend, Holly's, one of her sons or grandsons. Also, what's happened at Fort Bliss, they've been naming streets after the WASP as they build new facilities. The base has been growing because they move stuff to El Paso from overseas, etc. So the Fort Bliss and Biggs are continuing to grow. And so when they build new housing, they name streets after some of the WASP, including my mother. All right. First women, subsequent to, their service, they would have reunions every 2 years. So here's a picture of one of the reunions, which I think, is in Sweetwater back in 1986. And at that time, they could all still, get their uniforms on. My mother's uniform was donated to a local El Paso museum, but they didn't properly care for it, and it disintegrated due to dry rot. There's what the Congressional Gold Medal looked like. All the WASP women, there were multiple versions of each side of this medal presented to the WASP. One side had 2 versions, the other side had 3 versions, and they got to vote as a group as to what the final medal would look like. So what you see here, was their choice. Here's some other, as I mentioned, a gentleman there, when the Congressional Gold Medal was making the news back in 2009, that was happening, a young man named Rudy Reyes, who was a videographer for one of the local TV stations, got hold of me. Mom was still here living with us, and he wanted to interview both her and I and some others here in Houston that were related to the program. One of the women in the picture on the far left there, that's a picture of one of the women that worked for the aviation company that ran the WASP training program. And her name was Celeste Graves. She lived up in Magnolia. She passed away just recently, but she was 103 years old when she passed away. So mom maintained a relationship with her. We had lunches with her in the past. But anyway, these are some other pictures. There's Lois and the 2 Loises and me at one of the reunions. On the right is one of the women from the class of 43-3 that got trained to fly the B-29. In this case, You see the Ladybird logo there and the Fifanello icon. Colonel Tibbets, that dropped the bombs over Japan, trained these women to fly the B-29 because he was having trouble getting the men to fly the B-29. If you didn't taxi fast enough and keep the engines cool, the engines would catch on fire, and that's not a good thing. So that scared a lot of the men. So he trained these two women to fly it. He had them fly that into the training commands for the men. The men finally realized, well, if those women can do it, I guess I better do it. And of course, the middle picture there is they trained to fly on the B-29. Now, there's a documentary called Big's Fly Girls. There's a link to it on YouTube. That link is also available from my website, and so you can get to it from there. Or like I said, you can send me an email and I'll send you the link. And of course, in Texas, they had their own version of the Emmy Awards and called the Lone Star Emmy Awards. And this documentary, Big Fly Girls, Heroines of the Sky, with the KFOX TV there, won its category, Texas Heritage Program Special. Okay, there's a picture of Rudy and his the anchor woman that spoke, did all the narrative during the video, going up to get their award as a part of that documentary was being displayed on a large screen there. There's Rudy and the co-host that helped do that. And in closing, here's a class photo for the 43-3 graduation in Sweetwater. Various information, a lot of the photos here are from my mother's own photo library that I've tried to maintain. Still got lots of stuff that hasn't been digitized. Need to turn it over to the Texas Women's University so they can capture all that stuff for their archives. Of course, got my own website again there. And we have research, it was Rudy Reyes, the videographer that did that documentary. Also found the details, documents on the Swoosh, Alexander the Swoosh. And that does it. So again, my email address is my initials and last name, CAHAILEY @swbell.net. If you have any questions about this or just other things, but specifically about this particular presentation, send me an email. I'm sorry, excuse me. The picture in my background here is one of the walls in our family home where I've pretty much dedicated anything related to my mother on that wall. And there's a replica of her that was done by a friend of the WASP who was doing this for a short period of time. You do a high resolution photo, get it posed, and then she inserts the plaque in front with the WASP picture and a story about that WASP. So it's almost a life-size version of Mom in the room, kind of keeping an eye on things. But again, that's what I have for the Bigs 5. Hope you found that interesting. And again, let me know if you got any questions. Send me an email, cahaley@swbell.net. Hope you all have a good rest of your day. Take care now.